Here's my latest book review for the publisher New in Chess, and it concerns this book, Beyond Material. There we go, hopefully you can see that. Beyond Material by Davorin Kuljasevic, who's a Croatian Grandmaster. And it costs $24.95 and is 336 pages long. Well, before I say any more about this book, perhaps you'd like to have a look at this position. White has just played the queen to d2, and it's black to play. So while I'm yakking about the book, you can have a think about that position. Black to play, how do you play here? So I've been looking at this book recently and using it with one of my students. And found it extremely useful. So I'm very happy to recommend this book. So basically the author is discussing material and the value of material and how it's often good to think in a non-materialistic way, and that the value of your pieces can actually change according to the position. So this is about sacrificing material, perhaps the exchange, perhaps a piece, sometimes a queen, sometimes a pawn. So for example, in chapter 1, he talks about the human attachment to material, and that kind of lays the foundations for a non-materialistic way of thinking. And he discusses how, in chapter 2, how the value of pieces can change according to position type. He explores in chapter 3 and 4 how pieces relate to time and space. That sounds very philosophical, but there are lots of really great practical examples. Talks about in chapter 5 the psychology of non-materialism, and that's really interesting, how the game flow can change when you sacrifice material. And then what I think is really great is in one of the final chapters, chapter 6, he talks about how it's not always good to think in a non-materialistic way, and sometimes it is good to be greedy and sometimes good to take pieces. So I think that's really good that he does challenge the notions that he's actually putting forward as well. So lots of great material, lots of really good exercises. As I said, I've been using this with one of my students and found them really good, a good basis for discussion. So let's start with this position anyway. So black to play. And actually the author is playing white here. And here, well, his opponent played the bishop back to d7. And instead, the author thinks knight f4 is a good move. So the idea is this, that if the knight is captured, so black is now a pawn down, but it's worth it because that bishop just breathes fire across the board. Now, you can't pinpoint any tangible compensation. You know, there's no great attack for black here, but that bishop is just so much more powerful now. In fact, I mean, the author points out bishop e5, but I quite like a5, so that black may be able to use that a file, which looks very natural to me, because if white challenges with a rook, then it's going to be self-pinning with that bishop. So yeah, he mentions knight f4 as a good move. White doesn't need to take, but then again, if, say, knight d5, then the knight drops back to e6 and has pretty good control over these key squares. But in the game, let's just see what happened, because basically black either overlooked that idea or didn't have the courage to give up a pawn. But look what happens, because very quickly he fell into a passive position. Let's just see here. He took that knight and then played knight f4. But after this, well, you can see that white is going to gain control over the c-file very shortly. That knight isn't doing too much in this situation, and well, white won a very smooth game. So that's a little taste. Let me give you another taste. This is a really interesting game. Bardo Jobava, a favourite of mine on the channel, really interesting player, against Alberto David, strong Italian Grandmaster. And well, this position particularly appealed to me because it's from a Queen's Gambit or some kind of Queen's Gambit related position. We have this very typical pawn structure on both sides. And David has built up a nice attacking position here with black. But Jobava has put the knight back on e1 to protect this key square. And he's ready to break with b5. Now, a really interesting move from David. He plays a5. Would you have considered that move? I think that's really interesting. So Jobava took. Well, looks very natural because it opens up the b file. And now here's the idea. Bishop takes knight. Now, pawn takes is impossible because there's actually a pin. So rook takes. Knight e6, attacking the rook. Now the idea is if the rook goes back, then you can either play knight takes d4 and exploit that pin. In fact, of course, white doesn't need to take, and it's balanced. Or black can play c5. That's a very interesting move. Again, exploiting the pin. Maybe looking to take here. Maybe looking to push on with c4. So after knight e6, what did Jobava do? Well, he just played knight d3. No problem at all. Gave up the exchange. But this changes the flow of the position because suddenly there is a danger that black could end up in a passive position here. This pawn is obviously a target. Difficult to defend. If rook a8, knight takes b7 here, queen b1. And even in this endgame, well, this could actually be rather unpleasant for black because that knight is so strong. It's a strong passed a pawn. White controls the open file. Difficult to find counterplay for black on the other side of the board. So this is really interesting. David just ignored the queen side and played queen g5 and played for an attack on the king side. I think this is a really instructive example where you can see the ebb and flow of a game. Both players trying to gain the initiative, trying to gain control. And here David started to weaken the king side and here actually took on e3. And well, now white is a pawn up. In fact, David should have taken on g3 and then it's very messy. He took here and well, after more adventures, Jobava won the game. But still, this counterattack by David, still a pretty good idea. So that's another example anyway. This is very interesting, very typical position. This arose from a Queen's Gambit accepted. Typical isolated queen pawn position. There's a pin here. And this is a game Artemiev against Motilev. Motilev played g5. So trying to break the pin. Bishop g3 is quite possible, but Artemiev, well, this is very typical of him. Such an exciting player. He took the pawn on g5. And this kind of sacrifice, of course, is so common. You find it in the Gioco Piano, you find it in the Spanish. Many, many openings where white has the opportunity to take here. Is it any good? Well, that's the kind of thing that's discussed. This was actually in the section on psychology of sacrifices and how it changes the dynamic in the position. And actually, Motilev's position objectively was fine, but he went wrong very quickly and lost that one. Let me show you one more example. This was one of the exercises that I looked at with one of my students. I found this very interesting. So Aryushenko against Motilev from Dubai 2005. So it's white to play. How do you play in this position? It's very tense. You can see that white has some kind of blockade on the king side, preventing this pawn advancing, so has some security. Black has security on the other side of the board. That kind of locks things down. What's white's best move here? Well, Aryushenko played b4, really interesting, allowing black to take, giving up the exchange. And here, well, this would be a lot of fun for white, because without that dark squared bishop, it's very hard for black to break through on the king side. In the meantime, this pawn can be targeted. If that pawn drops, then these two look really dangerous. So, in fact, Motilev did not take here, but instead pushed with e3. I remember with my student we looked at rook e8, and then I thought the best idea for white was to blockade here. And, well, of course, it's not, it's a bit passive, but at least it stops black from breaking. In the game, black played e3 and broke through straight away. And now there's a clever move, queen d6, attacking the rook, but also attacking this pawn. So actually after this, the game ends in a draw by perpetual check. So just, not a spectacular example, but I rather like that one because it shows the power of these blockades on both sides of the board, actually, and how important that is. I think that's all the examples I've got, actually. But anyway, I found this a really interesting book, and a very balanced book with lots of excellent exercises. Lots of examples from chess history, but also coming right up to date with some of Carlsen's games as well. So I can warmly recommend this book. Very practical, very well written. There's a kind of logical flow, you could say. A very well argued book and very instructive. So there we go. Beyond Material by Davorin Kuljasevic, available from newinchess.com. You can get it from the online shop there, newinchess.com, and $24.95.